He wasn't supposed to be buried with secrets still breathing inside him. The morning air over Arlington hung cold and still, the kind that carried silence like a weight, pressing it gently over rows of white headstones that stretched farther than the eye could follow. Each one a story paused, not ended, and beneath a pale gray sky, a small crowd gathered in quiet formation around a single flag-draped coffin resting above freshly turned earth, the red, white, and blue folding softly in the wind like a final salute that refused to fade. And beside it stood Shadow, a German shepherd with a coat dark as storm clouds and eyes that did not waver, not from the coffin, not from the space around it, not even from the man who held his leash with both hands as if gripping something fragile, something he didn't fully understand, because Shadow was not grieving the way they expected. He wasn't lying down, wasn't whimpering, wasn't retreating into the quiet sorrow that dogs sometimes mirror in human loss. Instead, he stood tall, rigid, ears forward, chest rising slow, and controlled as if listening to something no one else could hear. And when the chaplain's voice began to move through the air, low and steady, speaking of honor and sacrifice and a life given in service, Shadow didn't lower his head, didn't blink, didn't soften. He watched, and then, without warning, he stepped forward, the leash pulling taut as the handler behind him whispered his name under his breath, trying to calm him, trying to guide him back into place. But Shadow resisted, not violently, not wildly, just firmly, like a soldier refusing an order that didn't feel right. And then it came, a sound that cut through the ceremony not like chaos but like truth, a sharp, deliberate bark that echoed across the marble and stone, turning heads, freezing hands, halting breath, one bark, then another, deeper this time, urgent, focused, directed not at the sky, not at the people, but at the coffin itself. And for a moment no one moved, because grief has rules, and this was not one of them. And yet there was something in the dog's stance, something in the way his paws planted into the earth, as if anchoring himself between what was seen and what was known, that made the silence feel different, heavier, like it was waiting for permission to break. And Shadow stepped closer, his nose lifting slightly, drawing in the air, searching, confirming, and then he shifted, just enough to reveal it, the smallest change in direction, his gaze flicking not to the coffin now, but beyond it, to the edge of the gathered mourners where a man stood just a little too still, just a little too composed, hands folded, eyes hidden beneath the brim of a dark hat, and Shadow's low growl rolled out like distant thunder, not loud, not aggressive, but certain, and the handler felt it through the leash, that vibration of instinct that had once saved lives in places far from here, places where hesitation meant loss. And he swallowed hard, glancing from the dog to the coffin and back again, because something wasn't right. Something had slipped past human eyes, but not past this one loyal animal. And as the wind picked up, just enough to ripple the flag across the casket, Shadow lunged forward one final step, placing himself directly in front of it, blocking it, guarding it, as if the man inside was not gone, not yet, not until whatever truth lay hidden beneath wood and cloth was brought into the light. And in that suspended moment, with breath held and time stretched thin, the ceremony stopped being about farewell and became something else entirely. The handler's grip tightened as Shadow held his ground, the leash no longer a guide but a question, and around them the quiet discipline of the ceremony began to fracture in subtle ways, a shifting of boots against gravel, a glance exchanged between officers, the chaplain's voice trailing off mid-sentence, as if even he could feel that something sacred had been interrupted by something more urgent than ritual. And the wind carried the faint scent of damp earth and polished wood, mixing with the distant hum of traffic far beyond the cemetery gates, a reminder that the world had not stopped even if this moment had. And Shadow's eyes never left that single point beyond the coffin, fixed now on the man at the edge of the crowd, the one who did not step forward, did not bow his head, did not mirror the grief that wrapped itself around every other face present. And it was not accusation in the dog's stare, not anger, but recognition, the kind that settles deep in instinct long before it reaches understanding. And the handler, Sergeant Miller, felt it in his chest like a quiet alarm, the same feeling he used to trust in the field when something unseen shifted just enough to matter. And he lowered himself slightly, one knee brushing the cold ground as he leaned closer to Shadow, his voice barely above a breath. Easy, boy. What is it? But Shadow did not look back, did not acknowledge the voice, because whatever held his attention was not behind him. It was still ahead, still unresolved. And then he moved again, not forward this time, but sideways, positioning himself between the coffin and the crowd, his body forming a line that no one had asked for, but no one dared to cross. And that was when Captain Reynolds stepped in, his uniform crisp, his expression controlled in the way leadership demands even when uncertainty creeps in. And he spoke calmly, but with a firmness that carried expectation. "Sergeant, get your dog under control." And Miller hesitated, just for a second, because control was not the right word for what this was. This was something else, something older than commands and training, something that had been earned over years of silent communication between a man and an animal who had once relied on each other to make it home. And he shook his head slightly, not in defiance, but in confusion. "Sir, he is not reacting like this without a reason." And the words hung there, fragile but undeniable, and a few of the older Marines in attendance shifted their stance, their eyes narrowing not in doubt, but in memory, because they had seen this before, not here, not in a place meant for rest, but in places where instinct was the difference between safe and sorry. And one of them, a graying staff sergeant with a voice worn by years, spoke just loud enough to carry. "Dogs do not get it wrong." And that was all it took to change the air, because suddenly this was not just a disruption, it was a possibility. And Shadow's growl deepened, still low, still controlled, but insistent, as if time itself was running thinner by the second. And then he turned his head sharply back toward the coffin, stepping closer until his nose hovered inches from the flag-draped surface, inhaling, pausing, inhaling again, and his body stiffened in a way that was not grief, not fear, but certainty. And he let out a single bark, louder than before, sharper, final, and it echoed across the headstones like a call that refused to be ignored. And Sergeant Miller looked up at Captain Reynolds, the question now no longer his alone. "Sir, we need to check." And for a long moment the captain said nothing, his jaw set, his eyes moving from the dog to the coffin, and then briefly, almost imperceptibly, to the man standing at the edge of the crowd, who now seemed just a fraction less still than before. And something in that subtle shift, that almost invisible crack in composure, tipped the balance. And Reynolds exhaled slowly, the weight of protocol pressing against the pull of instinct. And finally he nodded once, deliberate and measured. "Open it." And the word moved through the gathered crowd like a ripple through still water, quiet but undeniable. And as two Marines stepped forward, hands steady but eyes uncertain, Shadow did not move back, did not yield. He stood his ground, watching, waiting, as if everything depended on what would happen in the next few seconds. And somewhere beyond the gray sky, a faint break-in. The clouds let a thin line of light slip through, touching the edge of the flag just as the first latch clicked open. The first latch gave way with a soft metallic click that sounded far louder than it should have in a place built for silence. And the second followed just a breath later, each movement deliberate, careful, as if the men handling the casket understood without saying that they were no longer simply performing a ritual, but stepping into something uncertain, something that had shifted beyond procedure. And Shadow leaned forward, his body tense but controlled, his nose lifting again as that faint, almost imperceptible scent reached him, something warm beneath the cold stillness of polished wood and folded fabric, something that did not belong to death. And Sergeant Miller felt it too, not as a smell, but as a change in the air, the way a room feels different just before a storm breaks. And around them the gathered Marines stood frozen, not from fear but from instinct, each man and woman present understanding that whatever came next would not be forgotten. And Captain Reynolds took one slow step closer, his eyes fixed on the lid as the final seal loosened, his voice quiet, but steady. "Easy, take it slow." And the two Marines nodded, lifting the lid just enough for a narrow gap to form, a thin line between what was assumed and what might be. And for a heartbeat nothing happened, no movement, no sound. Only the wind brushing softly against the rows of white stones behind them. And then Shadow reacted, not with a bark this time, but with a sharp intake of breath. his entire body shifting forward as if pulled by something undeniable, his ears snapping upright, his tail stiff, and a low sound escaped him. Not a growl, not a whine, but something in between, something that carried urgency without panic. And Sergeant Miller's voice came out barely above a whisper. "He smells something." And the words landed with weight, because they did not need explanation, and the lid rose another inch, then another, and the interior of the coffin came into view slowly, like a truth reluctant to be revealed. And at first it looked exactly as it should, the uniform pressed, the flag carefully arranged, the stillness complete, but Shadow did not move back, did not soften. He stepped closer, placing his front paws gently against the edge, his nose dipping just inside the opening. And then everything changed, because he inhaled deeply and froze, not in confusion, but in confirmation, and he let out a single, sharp bark that cut through the air like a signal. And one of the Marines leaning over the casket flinched slightly, his eyes narrowing as if trying to see something that had not been there a moment before. And then he blinked, leaned in closer, his breath catching as his hand hovered just above the chest of the man inside, not touching, just sensing, and his voice came out unsteady, almost disbelieving. "Sir, wait." And Captain Reynolds stepped forward immediately, his composure cracking just enough to reveal the urgency beneath it. "What is it?" And the Marine swallowed hard, his gaze locked on the figure within. I think he is still warm." And the words spread through the crowd like a ripple that no one could stop, and for a second no one moved, because the mind resists what it cannot immediately accept. But Shadow did not hesitate. He pressed his head further into the opening, his nose brushing against the fabric, searching, confirming again and again as if to make sure the truth did not slip away. And Sergeant Miller felt his own pulse quicken, his training telling him to remain calm while everything inside him leaned toward disbelief. And Captain Reynolds lowered himself beside the casket, his hand steady as he reached forward, pausing just above the uniform before finally making contact. Light, careful, and his eyes widened just slightly, enough for those closest to see, and he drew in a slow breath, his voice now quieter than before. "Get medical now." And the command broke the stillness at last, boots shifting, radios crackling softly as calls were made, but through it all Shadow remained where he was, unmoving, unwavering, his gaze fixed on the face inside the coffin as if he had known all along, as if the silence everyone else accepted had never convinced him. And as the light from the thinning clouds above fell gently across the open casket, there was the faintest change, so small it could have been missed by anyone not already watching for it. A subtle rise beneath the fabric, a rhythm so slight it seemed almost imagined, and yet it was there, undeniable. And Shadow's ears twitched once, his body relaxing just enough to reveal what he had been holding all this time. Not grief, not confusion, but certainty. The shift from ceremony to urgency happened without a single command being shouted. It moved through the air like a current, subtle but unstoppable, as radios came alive with clipped voices and distant confirmation tones, and two medics who had been standing respectfully at the edge of the gathering were suddenly at the center, their movements precise, practiced, guided not by panic but by the weight of what they now understood, and Captain Reynolds stepped back just enough to give them space, though his eyes never left the open casket, never left the faint rise beneath the uniform that had already rewritten everything they thought they knew about this morning. And Shadow remained at the edge, his front paws still braced against the wood, his breathing steady now, no longer urgent, no longer searching, because whatever question had driven him to break the silence had been answered, and Sergeant Miller loosened his grip on the leash, not releasing it, but no longer holding it tight, as if he too understood that control was no longer the point, trust was, and one of the medics leaned in carefully, his hand moving to the side of the man's neck, fingers light, respectful, waiting for something that might not come, and then his posture changed, just slightly, just enough to signal that something had been found, and he glanced up at his partner, his voice low but certain. "There is a pulse," and the words did not echo, they settled, deep and heavy, into every person standing there, and for a moment no one spoke, because relief does not always arrive as noise, sometimes it arrives as stillness, as disbelief that refuses to rush itself, and then everything moved at once, a stretcher being called for, equipment brought forward, careful hands working in quiet coordination as the man inside the coffin was no longer treated as memory but as presence, and Shadow stepped back just enough to allow the medic's room. But he did not leave, his eyes following every movement, every touch, every breath, as if guarding not just a body, but a promise, and Sergeant Miller knelt beside him again, this time not to restrain, but to steady himself, his voice soft, almost a confession. You knew, you never believed it. And Shadow flicked one ear back at the sound, acknowledging without turning, because his focus remained forward, fixed on the man whose stillness had deceived everyone else. And as the medics worked, one of them carefully adjusted the collar of the uniform, exposing just enough to check again, to confirm again, and the faint rhythm was still there, fragile but steady, like a thread that refused to break, and Captain Reynolds exhaled slowly, a breath he did not realize he had been holding, his shoulders lowering just slightly as the weight of command shifted into something more human, more personal, and he turned his head, his gaze cutting once more toward the edge of the crowd, toward the man who had stood too still before, but now that place felt different, emptier, as if whatever had been there had quietly slipped away in the moment attention shifted, and the absence did not go unnoticed, not by him, not by the few others whose instincts had been sharpened by years of reading what was not said. And Reynolds' eyes narrowed just slightly. But he said nothing, not yet, because the priority in front of him demanded all of his focus. And as the stretcher arrived and the medics began the careful process of lifting the man from the coffin, moving slowly, deliberately, honoring both the fragility of his condition and the gravity of the moment, Shadow let out a soft exhale, a sound that carried neither tension nor relief, but something quieter, something closer to completion. And he lowered himself finally onto all fours, not in surrender, but in watchful calm, his job not finished, but no longer urgent. And as the flag that had covered the coffin was gently folded aside, catching a sliver of sunlight that had broken through the clouds above, the scene transformed completely. What had been a farewell became a return, what had been an ending revealed itself as something unfinished, and through it all, Shadow remained exactly where he needed to be, steady, silent, and certain, the only one who had listened when silence tried to convince everyone else that there was nothing left to hear. The stretcher rolled forward with a quiet urgency that felt almost reverent, its wheels whispering against the gravel path as the medics guided it into place, and every movement around it carried a new kind of weight, no longer the solemn stillness of farewell, but the fragile hope of something not yet lost, and Captain Reynolds stood just to the side, his posture still disciplined but his eyes softer now, watching as the man who had nearly been buried was carefully lifted, inch by inch, from the coffin that had already claimed him in the minds of everyone present, and Shadow rose again as they moved, not with tension, but with purpose, stepping alongside the stretcher as if he had been assigned to it, as if this had always been his post. And Sergeant Miller followed close behind, his hand resting lightly on the leash, though he no longer needed to guide. Because Shadow did not hesitate, did not falter, he matched every step, every shift, his gaze fixed on the face of the man being carried, watching for the smallest sign, the faintest movement, and for a brief moment, as the light shifted through the thinning clouds above, that face seemed to change, not dramatically, not enough for certainty, but enough to make Miller's breath catch, a subtle twitch near the eyes, a slight tightening that could have been dismissed if not for the context. If not for the fact that nothing about this moment could be dismissed anymore. And one of the medics noticed it too, leaning in just slightly, his voice calm but edged with something close to awe. Stay with us. You are not done yet. And the words were not loud, not meant for anyone but the man on the stretcher, but they carried anyway, threading through the quiet like a promise. And as they began to move toward the waiting vehicle at the edge of the cemetery, the gathered Marines parted without instruction, creating a path that felt less like protocol and more like respect for something that had just rewritten the meaning of the day, and Shadow stayed close. So close that at one point his shoulder brushed against the side of the stretcher, a brief, gentle contact that seemed to anchor both of them in the same reality, and Sergeant Miller felt something shift inside him, something he could not name, but recognized all the same, the realization that what they had just witnessed was not luck, not coincidence, but something quieter, something earned through years of trust that did not need explanation. And behind them, the open coffin remained, the flag folded neatly. Now, the emptiness inside it no longer a symbol of loss but of interruption. A story paused before its final line could be written, and Captain Reynolds turned once more, his eyes scanning the crowd again, searching for the man who had drawn Shadow's attention earlier. But the space where he had stood was now filled only with absence, and that absence lingered, unanswered, but not forgotten. And Reynolds made a note of it in the only way he knew how, by holding it in silence, by storing it for later, because not every truth reveals itself all at once. Some wait, just like this one had, beneath layers of assumption and time. And as the stretcher reached the vehicle and the doors were opened, the medics worked quickly but carefully, securing the man inside, checking again, confirming again, because doubt had no place here anymore. Only action, and Shadow stopped just outside, his body still, his eyes following until the last moment, until the doors began to close, and then, just before they did, there it was, small, almost imperceptible, but real, a faint movement of the fingers resting against the fabric, a slight curl that did not belong to stillness, and Shadow saw it, his ears lifting, his posture straightening just enough to acknowledge what the others might have missed, and he let out a soft, single exhale, not a bark, not a growl, just breath, as if releasing something he had been holding since the moment this day began. And when the doors finally shut and the vehicle pulled away, carrying with it not a memory but a life still unfolding, Shadow remained where he stood for a second longer, watching, waiting, until it disappeared beyond the trees, and only then did he turn back, his gaze sweeping once across the now quiet cemetery, where the wind had settled and the silence had returned. But it was not the same silence as before. It was lighter, different, as if it too had learned something, as if it now understood that even in a place built for endings, there are moments when something refuses to end at all. The sound of the vehicle faded into the distance, swallowed by the quiet roads beyond the cemetery gates, and for a long moment no one moved, as if the entire place needed time to understand what had just happened, to adjust to the sudden shift from mourning to something far less certain. And Sergeant Miller finally exhaled, a slow release of breath he had been holding since Shadow first broke the silence, his hand lowering to rest gently against the dog's neck, fingers brushing through the thick fur, as if grounding himself in something real, something he could still trust without question. And Shadow remained still, his body calm now, the tension gone, but his eyes still alert, scanning the space with that same quiet awareness that had changed everything. And Captain Reynolds stepped forward again, his boots pressing softly into the gravel, his gaze sweeping across the remaining attendees, many of whom were still standing exactly where they had been, their expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and reflection, because moments like this do not resolve quickly, they linger, they settle into the mind slowly, reshaping what people think they understand about endings and certainty. And Reynolds cleared his throat slightly, not to restore order, but to acknowledge what had been broken and what had taken its place. "This service is postponed," he said, the word chosen carefully, because it carried more truth than any other option, and a few quiet nods followed, no questions asked, no objections raised, because there was nothing to argue with, only something to accept. And as the small crowd began to disperse, footsteps quiet and measured, voices low and restrained, Sergeant Miller remained where he was, his attention still on Shadow, who now shifted his weight slightly, turning his head toward the path where the vehicle had disappeared, as if measuring distance, as if calculating something unseen. And Miller followed that gaze, then looked back down, his voice softer now, almost thoughtful. "You knew he was still there, didn't you?" And Shadow blinked once, slow and steady, not as an answer, but as a presence, a confirmation that did not need language. And behind them, the open coffin remained, no longer the center of attention, but not ignored either, its emptiness carrying a different kind of meaning now. Not loss, but interruption, a pause in something that refused to conclude on schedule. And Captain Reynolds approached it one last time, his hand resting briefly against the edge, his eyes lowering for just a second before lifting again, sharper now, more focused, because something else had taken root beneath the surface of the day. something that did not belong to ceremony or coincidence, and he turned his head slightly, his voice quiet but direct as he spoke to one of the nearby officers. "I want a full review of everything leading up to this, no assumptions." And the officer nodded immediately, understanding without needing further explanation, because there had been too many small details that did not align, too many moments that now demanded a second look. And as Reynolds stepped away, his attention shifted once more to the edge of the cemetery, to that empty space where a man had stood and then vanished. And this time there was no mistaking the feeling that lingered there, not absence alone, but intention, something that had moved deliberately out of sight. And he filed that away as well, knowing that some answers do not come in the moment, but they always leave a trace. And Sergeant Miller finally rose to his feet, giving the leash a gentle motion, not to pull, but to signal, and Shadow responded immediately, turning with him, but not before casting one last look toward the horizon where the vehicle had gone. And there was something in that look, something steady and assured, as if the story that had almost ended here had simply moved somewhere else, somewhere that would require patience and faith, and the same kind of quiet attention that had already proven itself once. And as they began to walk away, the wind moved lightly through the rows of white headstones, no longer heavy, no longer burdened, carrying instead a softer presence, like a breath released after being held too long. And in that quiet shift, one truth remained, simple and unspoken, that what had been saved today was not just a life, but the chance for something unfinished to find its way back into the light. The road away from the cemetery stretched quiet and pale beneath a sky that had begun to clear, the gray lifting just enough to let a thin wash of blue show through. And Sergeant Miller drove with both hands steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed ahead, but his thoughts still anchored behind him, replaying every second from the moment Shadow had first barked to the instant the stretcher disappeared beyond the trees. And beside him in the passenger seat, Shadow sat upright, alert but calm, his posture relaxed in a way that spoke not of exhaustion but of resolution, as if whatever had unsettled him earlier had now been set back into place. And the hum of the engine filled the silence between them, low and constant, broken only by the occasional passing car on the opposite side of the road, each one moving forward without knowing what had just unfolded only miles behind them. And Miller glanced over once, studying the dog's profile, the strong line of his muzzle, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. And he shook his head slightly, a quiet disbelief still lingering beneath the surface. "You saved him," he murmured, not expecting a response, not needing one, because the truth of it sat plainly between them, undeniable. And Shadow's ears flicked once at the sound of his voice, a small acknowledgement, nothing more, and they drove on in silence until the distant outline of the military hospital came into view, its structure clean and precise against the horizon, a place built for healing, for second chances that often arrive too late, but not today, not this time. And as they pulled into the lot, the controlled movement of staff and vehicles created a different kind of rhythm, purposeful, efficient, and Miller parked quickly, stepping out into the cool air that carried the faint scent of antiseptic and trimmed grass. And Shadow was already moving as soon as the door opened, stepping down onto the pavement with quiet certainty, his gaze lifting toward the entrance as if he already knew where to go. And inside, the corridors stretched long and bright, the fluorescent lights steady overhead, reflecting off polished floors that carried the echo of footsteps in a soft, repeating cadence. And a nurse at the front desk looked up as they approached her, expression shifting from routine to recognition as she took in the uniform, the dog, the urgency that lingered even in their calm. "They just brought him in," she said before Miller could speak, her voice gentle but efficient. "Room 3, down the hall to your left." And Miller nodded once, offering a quiet thanks before moving forward, Shadow pacing beside him, not pulling, not rushing, but moving with intent, each step measured, guided by something deeper than instruction. And as they reached the door, Miller hesitated for just a second, his hand resting on the handle, the weight of the moment settling in, because what waited on the other side was no longer a question of belief, but of confirmation. And he pushed the door open slowly, stepping inside. And there, beneath the soft hum of monitors and the quiet movement of medical staff, lay the man they had nearly lost, his face pale but no longer still, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that filled the room with a kind of quiet victory. And Shadow stopped at the threshold, just for a breath, his body still, his eyes fixed, and then he stepped forward, slow and deliberate, approaching the bedside with a calm that felt almost reverent. And as he reached the edge, he lifted his head slightly, his nose drawing in the air once more, confirming what he had known all along. And Sergeant Miller stood just behind him, watching, waiting, and for a moment nothing happened. No sudden movement, no dramatic shift, only the steady presence of life where there should have been none. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the man's fingers moved again, a slight curl against the blanket, a response so small it could have been missed by anyone not looking for it. But Shadow saw it, his ears lifting, his body leaning forward just enough to close the distance. And he let out a soft breath, a quiet release that carried no urgency now, only certainty. As if to say without words that the story had not ended where everyone else had believed it would. And in that still room, filled with machines and quiet voices, something else settled in as well, something steady and unshakable, the understanding that loyalty does not follow rules, it does not wait for permission, it simply stays, it watches, and when the moment comes, it acts, even when the world has already decided it is too late. The room settled into a quiet rhythm that felt almost sacred, the steady beeping of the monitor marking time in soft, measured intervals, each sound a reminder that something fragile had been preserved. And Shadow remained at the bedside, his head level with the edge of the mattress, his eyes never leaving the man who lay there between sleep and return. And Sergeant Miller stood just behind him, arms at his sides, unsure whether to speak or simply witness what was unfolding, because there are moments that do not belong to words, only to presence. And a doctor entered quietly, her steps light against the polished floor, her expression composed but touched with a hint of something rare in her profession, something close to wonder. And she glanced at the monitor, then at the patient, and finally at the dog, taking in the full picture with a kind of careful respect. "He is stabilizing," she said softly, her voice calm, professional, but not distant. "It is early, but his body is responding." And Miller nodded, absorbing the words slowly, as if they needed time to settle into belief. And Shadow shifted slightly at the sound, not turning, not breaking his focus, but acknowledging the change in tone, the shift from uncertainty to cautious hope. And minutes passed in that quiet space, each one stretching longer than it should, filled with the kind of anticipation that does not rush itself. And then it happened again. Not imagined this time, not subtle enough to question. The man's hand moved more clearly, fingers tightening just slightly against the fabric, and the doctor stepped forward immediately, her attention sharpening. "Sir, if you can hear me, stay with us," she said, her voice steady, guiding. And the man's breathing changed, just enough to notice, a deeper pull, a stronger release. And Shadow responded instantly, his ears lifting, his body leaning forward just a fraction, closing the space between them until his nose hovered just above the man's hand. And for a brief moment, everything else faded. The machines, the voices, the room itself, leaving only that connection, silent and unspoken. And then, slowly, the man's eyes opened, not wide, not fully aware, but enough to break through the stillness that had surrounded him for so long. And his gaze shifted, unfocused at first, searching, adjusting to light and presence, and it landed there, on Shadow, as if guided by something deeper than sight. And there was a pause, a breath held between recognition and reality, and then the faintest movement of his lips, not forming a full word, but enough to carry meaning, enough to reach across the space between them. And Shadow exhaled softly, a quiet sound that carried no urgency now, only relief. And Sergeant Miller felt something tighten in his chest, something that had been held back finally releasing. And he stepped forward, his voice low, steady. "You are safe, sir. You are back." And the doctor nodded once, her focus already shifting to the next steps, to the careful process of bringing him fully back. But even she paused for just a second, her eyes lingering on the dog, on the way he remained still, attentive, unwavering, as if he had been waiting not for confirmation, but for permission to believe what he had already known. And outside the room, The hallway continued its quiet routine, unaware of the moment unfolding inside, unaware that a line had been crossed between what should have been and what was. And inside, the air felt different now, lighter, carrying something that had not been there before. Not just relief, but gratitude, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud. And as the man's eyes slowly closed again, not in absence, but in rest, Shadow remained where he was, his presence steady, his watch not yet finished, because some bonds do not end when the world thinks they should. They wait, they hold, and when the moment comes, they bring something back that no one else could reach. The hours that followed did not rush. They unfolded slowly, like a tide easing back from the shore, leaving behind something quieter, something changed, and the hospital room carried that stillness with a kind of gentle persistence. The steady rhythm of the monitor now no longer a question but an answer, each sound confirming what had once been doubted. And Sergeant Miller remained nearby, sometimes standing, sometimes sitting, never fully leaving, as if stepping away too soon might undo something fragile. And Shadow stayed closer still, his place at the bedside no longer urgent, but chosen, his presence calm, grounded, the way it had always been when everything else felt uncertain. And as the day stretched into late afternoon, the light through the window softened, turning from pale gray to a warmer tone that touched the edges of the room. And with it came a shift, subtle at first, then undeniable. The man on the bed stirred again, not just in reflex, but with intention, his breathing deeper now, steadier, his eyes opening once more, this time with more clarity, more awareness. And though they moved slowly, adjusting, focusing, they did not drift, they settled, finding the shape of the room, the outline of the figures beside him, and finally, they found Shadow, and something in his expression changed, not dramatically, not with sudden recognition, but with something softer, something that did not need explanation, and his lips parted slightly, forming a word that barely carried sound, but carried meaning all the same. And Shadow responded not with movement, not with noise, but by lowering his head gently against the side of the bed, close enough to be felt, close enough to remind. And Sergeant Miller stepped forward quietly, his voice low, steady. "You are back with us, sir. Take your time." And the man's gaze shifted briefly toward him, then back again, as if confirming the world around him piece by piece. And outside the room, life continued as it always does, footsteps in the hallway, distant voices, doors opening and closing. But inside, time seemed to move differently, slower, more deliberate, as if honoring the space between what had almost been lost and what had been returned. And later, when Captain Reynolds arrived, his uniform still precise but his expression carrying something deeper now, he paused at the doorway for a moment before stepping in, taking in the scene with a quiet understanding, and he nodded once, not as a command, but as acknowledgement, and his eyes moved briefly to Shadow, holding there for just a second longer, because some actions do not require reports, they speak for themselves. And as evening began to settle, the light outside dimming into a calm blue that pressed gently against the glass, the room grew quieter still, the man resting again, not in absence, but in recovery, his breathing even, his presence steady. And Shadow finally shifted, not away, but down, settling beside the bed. With a slow, careful motion, his body curling just enough to rest, but his ears still alert, his watch not abandoned, only softened, and Sergeant Miller leaned back slightly, allowing himself, for the first time that day, to breathe without tension, to let the weight of what had happened settle into something he could carry, something he would not forget. And in that quiet space, with the hum of machines and the soft rhythm of breath, there was no need for explanation, no need for words to define what had been witnessed, because some truths do not arrive in speeches or reports, they arrive in moments like this, in the stillness after everything should have ended, but did not. And as the night slowly took hold beyond the window, wrapping the world outside in calm darkness, one thing remained clear within those walls, simple and steady, that loyalty had not just stayed, it had listened, it had waited, and when the moment came, it had refused to let silence have the final word.